Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The game in the woods. Jake Morrison had been awake since 4:30 a.m., same as every day for the past 3 years. The habit stuck even after leaving the Forest Service. He moved through his small cabin with practiced efficiency, pulling on thermal underwear, wool socks, and his weathered cargo pants. The coffee maker gurgled to life as he laced his boots, the same Danner hiking boots that had carried him through 5 years of ranger work in Olympic National Park. Outside, the November morning hung gray and cold. Frost glazed his truck windows and his breath formed small clouds as he loaded his day pack. Water, energy bars, first aid kit, headlamp, emergency blanket, knife, rope. The gear felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from thousands of similar mornings. His phone buzzed at 6:15. Sarah Chen from the Park Service. Jake, sorry to call so early. We've got a missing hiker situation. Day 3 now. Search and rescue is stretched thin with that group lost on Mount Storm King and... She paused. You know the Hoh River Trail system better than anyone. Jake took a long sip of coffee. Details? Rebecca Martinez, 26, from Seattle. Last seen Tuesday morning at the Hoh River Trailhead. Solo hiker experienced according to her gear list. Was supposed to check in with her boyfriend yesterday. Equipment? Full winter gear, satellite communicator, the works. That's what's strange. Her communicator went silent Tuesday afternoon. Last ping was around mile marker 7 near those old ranger cabins. Jake knew the area. Dense old growth, multiple side trails, easy to get turned around even for experienced hikers. But a satellite communicator going silent? That meant either equipment failure or something had prevented her from using it. I'll head out in 20 minutes, he said. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes on winding forest roads. Jake's truck climbed through layers of mist that clung to the Douglas firs like gray fabric. At the parking area, he counted 4 vehicles. Rebecca's blue Honda Civic sat alone near the information board, frost still thick on its windshield. Jake shouldered his pack and studied the trailhead. Fresh boot prints in the damp earth, but nothing recent. A family with kids had been through yesterday, their sneaker treads mixing with hiking boot impressions from earlier in the week. But there, a clear print from a women's size 7 hiking boot, deep tread pattern. Rebecca's most likely. The Hoh River Trail started easy, following the riverbank through massive old growth. Jake moved at a steady pace, eyes constantly scanning. This was his first special ability at work, exceptional tracking. Where others saw just disturbed leaves and normal forest debris, Jake read stories. The bent fern frond that showed someone had passed, the scuffed bark on a fallen log where a boot had slipped, the slight depression in moss that most people would never notice. At the first mile marker, he found more of Rebecca's prints. Clear, confident stride. She'd been moving well, no signs of fatigue or confusion. Jake noted the time on his GPS, 8:47 a.m. If she'd started at dawn Tuesday, she would have passed this point around the same time. The second mile brought the first irregularity. Jake stopped beside a massive cedar, studying the ground. Rebecca's prints continued straight, but something else caught his attention. Another boot print, partially hidden under scattered leaves, size 10 or 11. Aggressive tread pattern. Fresh, no more than a day old. Jake knelt and brushed away more leaves. The print was deep, made by someone carrying significant weight. But the placement bothered him. It was 20 feet off the main trail near a cluster of huckleberry bushes. No logical reason for a hiker to step there unless they were deliberately staying out of sight. He followed the print's direction with his eyes and found a second one, then a third. The trail led parallel to the main path, staying just inside the tree line. Someone had been tracking along the trail without being on it. Jake's second ability kicked in, nature reading. The forest felt wrong here. Too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling from small animals. In healthy forest, there should be constant subtle noise. This silence suggested something had disturbed the natural patterns recently. He returned to Rebecca's trail and continued hiking, but now his senses were heightened. Every 50 yards he found more of the parallel tracks. Someone had been following the main trail from concealment, and their path intersected with Rebecca's timeline. At mile marker 4, Jake found Rebecca's first rest stop. A fallen log beside the trail showed where she'd sat. Boot prints, a small depression where her pack had rested, even a few granola bar crumbs. But there was something else. A cigarette butt, half buried under leaves. Jake picked it up carefully. The filter was hand-rolled, expensive tobacco. Not Rebecca's. Her gear list included no smoking supplies. Someone else had been here, watching her rest. The cigarette was fresh enough that the paper hadn't started to disintegrate from moisture. His third ability engaged human presence detection. The sensation hit him like a cold weight in his chest. Someone was watching him now. Jake continued examining the rest area, but his peripheral vision swept constantly. The feeling was unmistakable, honed through years of knowing when poachers or lost hikers were nearby before seeing them. He straightened slowly and called out, "Hello? If someone's out there, I'm with Search and Rescue, looking for a missing hiker." Only silence answered, but the watching sensation remained. Jake took a long drink from his water bottle, projecting casual behavior while his mind raced. Two possibilities. Either someone was hiding nearby, or he was dealing with someone sophisticated enough to observe from significant distance. He resumed hiking, but now he was hunting. His fourth ability, investigative intuition, began connecting patterns, the parallel tracking, the concealed observation post, the timing that matched Rebecca's movements. This wasn't random. Someone had been following her deliberately. At mile marker 6, Jake found where things had gone wrong. Rebecca's trail ended abruptly at a small clearing beside Mineral Creek. Her boot prints approached the creek's edge, then nothing. No sign of her crossing. No indication she'd continued upstream or downstream. Just an empty space where her trail should have continued. Jake spent 20 minutes searching the area. No blood, no signs of struggle, no dropped equipment. Rebecca had simply vanished beside the water. But his tracking ability found something else. The parallel trail emerged from the trees here. Size 10 boots approached from 3 different angles, converging on the spot where Rebecca had disappeared. More than one person had been involved. Jake knelt beside the creek, studying the bank. The soft mud should have shown clear prints if Rebecca had crossed, but the surface was strangely smooth. Too smooth. Someone had brushed it clean. His satellite communicator crackled. Sarah's voice. "Jake, any sign of her?" "Found her trail ending at Mineral Creek, mile 6. It's not good, Sarah. I think we're dealing with something more than a lost hiker." Static filled the pause. "What do you mean?" "Evidence of multiple people tracking her. Professional-level concealment. This looks like an abduction." "Jesus, I'm calling the sheriff. Can you continue searching?" Jake looked at his GPS. 2:30 p.m. Sunset at 5:15 this time of year. "I'll push to the old ranger station, see if I can pick up any more trail." The forest grew darker as Jake climbed toward the abandoned ranger cabins. Built in the 1940s, they'd been empty for 15 years, too remote for modern park operations. The trail here was less maintained, requiring more careful navigation. His fifth ability, natural orientation, kept him on course even as the path faded. Jake could sense direction like a compass needle, an internal awareness of magnetic north that had never failed him. It was this skill that had made him valuable as a backcountry ranger, able to navigate in whiteout conditions or dense fog. The first cabin appeared through the trees at 3:45 p.m. Jake approached carefully, every sense alert. The building was dark, windows boarded, but fresh footprints circled the structure. Multiple sets, including what looked like Rebecca's size 7s. The front door hung open. Jake drew his knife and approached the entrance. Inside, dusty floorboards showed clear evidence of recent activity. Footprints, disturbed debris, and something else. Drag marks, leading toward the back of the cabin. He followed the marks to a rear bedroom where he found Rebecca's pack. The pack sat in the center of the room, carefully placed rather than dropped. Jake examined it without touching. All the zippers were closed, straps neatly arranged. This was a message, not an accident. His communicator crackled again, but this time it wasn't Sarah's voice. Jake Morrison. The voice was calm, educated, with a slight accent he couldn't place. Former Forest Service, 5 years Olympic National Park, currently freelance search and rescue. Jake's blood went cold. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your work today. Quite impressive, actually. I expected the local search team to give up at the creek crossing. But you read the signs others would miss. Where's Rebecca Martinez? A soft chuckle. Safe for now. Though I suspect you know this isn't really about Rebecca anymore. Jake's mind raced. Whoever this was had accessed his radio frequency, knew his background, had been monitoring his progress. What do you want? To see what you're truly capable of. You have a reputation, Jake. Stories about your abilities in the backcountry, tracking skills that border on supernatural, navigation that defies explanation. I'm curious to test those skills against a more challenging opponent. The transmission ended. Jake stood in the empty cabin, processing what had just happened. This was no random abduction. Someone had taken Rebecca specifically to draw him out. But why? And how did they know enough about him to predict his involvement? He keyed his radio. Sarah, come in. Static. Sarah, this is Jake. Priority traffic. More static. His communicator had been jammed or blocked somehow. Jake checked his GPS. The screen flickered, then died. He tried his cell phone. No signal, which was normal for this area. But the timing was too convenient. Someone was cutting off his communication systematically. Darkness was coming fast. Jake had maybe 90 minutes of daylight left. He could retreat to his truck and return with backup tomorrow, or he could continue tracking while the trail remained fresh. But whoever was out here had demonstrated sophisticated planning and technical capability. They were ready for him. Jake made his choice. He activated his headlamp and continued deeper into the forest. The second cabin sat a half-mile up a steep switchback trail. As Jake climbed, his human presence detection ability screamed warnings. He was being watched from multiple positions. Whoever this was, they had people positioned throughout the area. The cabin's windows glowed with soft light, battery-powered lanterns. Jake approached from downhill using thick forest cover. Through a side window, he glimpsed movement. 2 figures in dark clothing, one significantly larger than the other. Rebecca was alive. Jake circled the building looking for the best approach. The main door faced downhill with clear fields of fire from the windows, but the back wall had no windows, and a large propane tank provided cover for the final 20 yards. He was planning his approach when the voice spoke again, this time from speakers hidden in the trees. Jake, there's no need to sneak around. Please join us. Use the front door. Jake froze. Night vision equipment, multiple observation posts, portable PA system. This level of preparation suggested military or law enforcement background. Rebecca Martinez will remain safe as long as you cooperate, the voice continued. But if you attempt any tactical approach, she becomes expendable. Walk to the front door, hands visible, weapon holstered. Jake had no choice. He walked uphill to the cabin entrance, hands raised, knife sheathed. The door opened before he could knock. The man who greeted him was in his 50s, average height, thinning gray hair. He wore dark tactical clothing but no visible weapons. What struck Jake immediately was his eyes. Intelligent, calculating, but not cruel. This wasn't a typical predator. Dr. Thomas Vance, the man said, extending his hand, as if they were meeting at a conference. Former professor of criminal psychology, University of Washington. Please come inside. Jake entered warily. The cabin's interior had been transformed into a command center. Battery-powered lights, communication equipment, detailed maps of the area pinned to the walls. Rebecca sat in a chair near the back wall, secured with zip ties but apparently unharmed. Are you hurt? Jake asked her. Rebecca shook her head. I'm okay. He hasn't... He's been polite, just watching me mostly. Vance smiled. Rebecca is an excellent subject for observation. Intelligent, well-prepared, but ultimately dependent on technology and infrastructure. When those fail, how does modern humanity adapt? What do you want? Jake asked. To understand something. Vance moved to a wall covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. 3 years ago, my wife and daughter were killed during a home invasion. I was giving a lecture that night about rehabilitation versus punishment in criminal justice. The perpetrators were repeat offenders I had personally recommended for early release programs. Jake studied the photographs. A woman and young girl, both smiling. Family vacation pictures, graduation photos, normal life destroyed. I spent my career believing humans were fundamentally good, Vance continued. That criminal behavior stemmed from environment, education, opportunity. That we could fix people through understanding and compassion. His voice hardened. I was wrong. So you became what you fought against. I became realistic. Humans are predators who've forgotten how to survive. We've built systems that protect the weak from natural selection, that reward complacency and punish preparation. Rebecca here is a perfect example. Excellent gear, satellite communication, GPS navigation. But when those tools fail, she's helpless. Vance turned to face Jake. But you're different. You succeeded where modern search and rescue would have failed. You read signs others miss, navigate without instruments, sense threats before they materialize. You're what humans used to be before we domesticated ourselves. Jake understood now. This is a test. An experiment. Can natural ability overcome technological advantage? Can instinct defeat planning? Vance smiled. I've been preparing for this encounter for 6 months, studying your background, your methods, your psychology. I have superior resources, detailed intelligence, and weeks of preparation. You have whatever skills brought you this far. What happens to Rebecca? That depends on you. If you can extract her and escape my area of operations before dawn, she goes free. If not, Vance shrugged. She becomes data for my research into human adaptability under stress. And if I refuse to play? Then she dies tonight and I begin this experiment with someone else tomorrow. Perhaps that family camping at Rialto Beach, or the college students planning to hike the Enchanted Valley next week. Jake felt cold rage building, but forced himself to think tactically. Vance had demonstrated extensive preparation and technical resources. Direct confrontation would likely fail. But the man had also revealed something important. He wanted to test Jake's natural abilities against his technological advantages. That suggested rules, limitations, some kind of structure to this experiment. What are the parameters? Jake asked. Vance seemed pleased by the question. Excellent. You understand this is more than random violence. He moved to a detailed topographical map. Your extraction zone is here, the main trailhead where you started this morning. Roughly 8 miles through challenging terrain in complete darkness. I have 6 associates positioned throughout the area, all with night vision and radio communication. Motion sensors on the main trails, thermal imaging at key choke points. He pointed to various locations on the map. Your advantages: knowledge of the terrain, natural navigation ability, and whatever other skills you've developed. My advantages: technology, numbers, and detailed intelligence about your likely routes and methods. Rules of engagement? Non-lethal force only. This is a learning exercise, not a killing spree. My people will attempt to recapture you using tranquilizer weapons and physical restraint. If they succeed, the experiment ends and Rebecca remains my research subject. If you escape with her, I honor our agreement. Jake studied the map. His 6th ability, spatial memory, activating. He remembered every trail, creek, ridge, and clearing in exacting detail. But Vance's positions were well chosen. The obvious routes were covered. It would require taking risks, using terrain most people would consider impassable. What's to stop me from killing your people and taking their equipment? Nothing, technically, but you won't. Vance smiled. Because you're not a killer, Jake. That's what makes this interesting. You'll try to win by using your skills, not by becoming like me. Rebecca spoke for the first time since Jake's arrival. This is insane. You can't just use people as lab rats. Vance turned to her. Can't I? Who's going to stop me? The authorities? They can't find me? Other people? They can't match my resources. He looked back at Jake. Unless someone proves that human nature can still overcome human technology. Jake made his decision. When do we start? Now. Vance handed him a small radio. This will let you monitor my team's communications. Consider it a handicap to make things more interesting. You have until sunrise, roughly 7 hours. Vance cut Rebecca's restraints. She stood shakily, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. Jake helped her check her gear. Her pack contained everything she'd started with, including her emergency supplies. How are you with night hiking? Jake asked her quietly. Not great, but I'll manage. Are you sure about this? There has to be another way. Jake looked at Vance, who was speaking quietly into a handheld radio. He's planned for conventional responses. Our best chance is to do exactly what he doesn't expect. They stepped out into the cold night. Jake's headlamp beam cut through dense forest, but he knew the light would make them easy targets. He turned it off. Can you see anything? Rebecca whispered. Enough. Jake's natural orientation ability was fully engaged now. He could sense the downhill slope, the direction of the main trail, the lay of the land, even in complete darkness. Stay close. Step where I step. They moved downhill through thick underbrush, avoiding the maintained trails. Jake led them toward Mineral Creek, following a route he'd used years ago to reach a remote research site. It was rough terrain, requiring careful footwork and occasional scrambling over fallen logs, but it would take them around Vance's most obvious surveillance positions. The radio crackled softly. Control, this is Observer 3. Motion sensor triggered on main trail, Sector 7. Copy. Teams 2 and 4 converge on that location. Jake smiled grimly. They were tracking his expected route while he took a path no rational person would attempt in darkness. But his spatial memory was guiding him perfectly. Every boulder, every fallen tree, every creek crossing exactly where he remembered from 5 years ago. They reached Mineral Creek after 30 minutes of careful movement. The water was ankle-deep, but shockingly cold. Rebecca gasped as they waded across. Control, we have the main trail covered. No sign of targets. Expand search pattern. Check all secondary trails. Jake led Rebecca up the opposite bank, following a game trail that paralleled the creek. This route would eventually connect with an old fire road, giving them a faster path toward the trailhead. But first, they had to cross an exposed ridge where Vance's thermal imaging would spot them easily. Observer 6, I have thermal contacts. 2 figures moving north along Cougar Ridge. Teams 5 and 6, intercept. Use tranquilizers only. Jake pulled Rebecca behind a massive fallen cedar. They've spotted us. We need to change tactics. He studied the terrain ahead. The ridge was unavoidable. Steep slopes on both sides. No alternative routes. But his spatial memory recalled something else. An old mine shaft, abandoned since the 1920s, located about 200 yards uphill. If it was still accessible, it might provide concealment until the search teams moved past. Can you handle a steep climb? Jake asked. Rebecca nodded, though she was already breathing hard from the creek crossing. They climbed directly upslope, using trees and boulders for handholds. The mine entrance was hidden behind thick huckleberry bushes, exactly as Jake remembered. The wooden support beams were rotted but still standing. In here. They squeezed through the narrow opening into musty darkness. Jake finally risked using his headlamp. The shaft extended about 20 feet into the hillside before ending in a pile of rubble. This is where gold prospectors worked in the 1920s, Jake explained quietly. Should buy us some time. Outside they could hear movement. Boots on gravel, low voices, the electronic beep of radio communications. Observer 6, targets lost visual. Last seen heading upslope toward old mining area. Teams 5 and 6, search pattern alpha. They can't have gone far. The search continued for an hour. Jake and Rebecca waited in complete silence as flashlight beams swept past the mine entrance multiple times. Finally, the voices moved away. Control, expanding search to fire road network. No contact in mining sector. Jake checked his watch. 11:30 p.m. They'd covered maybe 2 miles in 3 hours. At this pace, they wouldn't reach the trailhead before dawn. He needed to take more risks. They emerged from the mine and climbed to the ridge crest. From here, Jake could see lights moving throughout the valley. Vance's people searching systematically. But his route knowledge suggested a faster option. A steep descent through old-growth forest would bring them to the fire road in half the time. But it meant traveling through terrain where a single fall could break bones. "How's your balance?" Jake asked Rebecca. "Rock climbing is my hobby. I can handle steep stuff." They began the descent, moving from tree to tree down slopes that would challenge experienced mountaineers in daylight. Jake's natural orientation kept them on course, while his spatial memory guided them around the worst obstacles. Rebecca proved tougher than expected, matching his pace without complaint. The radio chattered constantly. "Control, teams 3 and 4 have secured the main trail, no contact. Observer 2 reports negative on thermal scanning, sectors 4 through 7. Expand perimeter to fire road network." They reached the fire road at 1:15 a.m., having cut their travel time significantly. But Jake knew this was where things would get dangerous. The fire road was the fastest route to the trailhead, but also the most obvious. Vance's people would be concentrating their efforts here. Jake studied the road through thick forest cover. No visible activity, but that didn't mean it was clear. He keyed the radio Vance had given him. "Control, this is Morrison." Static, then Vance's voice. "Jake, good to hear from you. I was beginning to worry you'd had an accident in that treacherous terrain. Just checking in. How are my odds looking?" Vance chuckled. "Better than I expected, honestly. You've avoided 3 separate interception attempts and chosen routes I didn't anticipate. Most impressive. What's your assessment?" "You're approximately 4 miles from extraction, with roughly 4 hours until sunrise. My teams are repositioning to cover the most likely approach routes. The challenge is about to increase significantly. Any interest in modifying the terms?" "Such as?" Jake was fishing for information about Vance's positioning. "Rebecca's slowing me down. What if I leave her somewhere safe and continue alone?" "Unacceptable. The exercise is specifically about extraction under adverse conditions. Besides, I suspect you're managing the terrain better than you're letting on." Vance was too smart to reveal tactical information. Jake tried a different approach. "Why psychology? What made you choose that field originally?" A pause. "Genuine curiosity about human nature. My father was a prison guard, told me stories about how people changed under stress. I wanted to understand the mechanisms behind moral flexibility. And now? Now I understand that morality is a luxury good, available only when survival is guaranteed. Remove that guarantee and humans revert to predatory behavior within hours. Is that what happened to you?" Another pause. "I didn't revert, Jake. I evolved. I accepted the truth about human nature and adapted accordingly. By becoming a predator yourself. By becoming realistic. My family died because I believed criminals could be rehabilitated, that human goodness was universal. That faith killed them, as surely as if I'd pulled the trigger myself." Jake could hear pain beneath Vance's controlled tone. The man wasn't a psychopath. He was someone whose core beliefs had been shattered by trauma, who'd rebuilt his worldview around the darkest possible interpretation of human nature. "Rebecca didn't kill your family?" "No, but she represents the same willful ignorance that I once embodied. Humans who trust in systems rather than developing personal capability, who assume rescue will come instead of learning to rescue themselves. So this is rehabilitation? Your version of therapy?" "This is education, for both of you." The transmission ended. Jake looked at Rebecca, who'd been listening to the conversation. "He's in pain," she said quietly. "Doesn't make him less dangerous." "No, but it means he's not pure evil. He's broken. Jake considered this. Vance's behavior suggested someone operating from a twisted ethical framework rather than simple sadism. He genuinely believed he was teaching important lessons about human nature and survival. That might be exploitable. They moved along the fire road, staying just inside the tree line. Jake's human presence detection was screaming warnings. They were walking into an ambush, but there was no alternative route that would get them to the trailhead in time. At 2:30 a.m., they reached the critical junction where the fire road met the main trail system. This was the most likely ambush point, a natural choke point that any tactical team would secure. Jake studied the area through night vision, borrowed from a searcher's pack they'd found cached beside the road. 3 heat signatures were positioned in an overlapping triangle, with clear fields of fire covering all approaches. Control, Team 7 in position at Junction Alpha. Motion sensors active. Copy, Teams 2 and 4 providing backup coverage. Jake needed a distraction. He found a large rock and threw it downhill, away from their intended route. The motion sensors triggered immediately. Control, we have movement in Sector 9. Teams 2 and 4, investigate. As the heat signatures moved toward the false alarm, Jake led Rebecca through the gap in their coverage. But they'd only traveled 50 yards when his radio crackled. Control, false alarm, returning to positions. They were back in the open when the teams repositioned. Jake pulled Rebecca behind a fallen log just as flashlight beams swept their location. Observer 4, possible movement near Junction Alpha. Teams 7, 2, and 4 converge on that location. This time there was no avoiding contact. Jake heard boots approaching from 3 directions, voices coordinating the search. He had maybe 30 seconds before they were discovered. His spatial memory provided the answer. 20 yards to their left, a steep creek cut ran downhill toward the main trail. It would be treacherous in darkness, but it was the only escape route they hadn't covered. "Can you handle a fast descent down a creek bed?" Jake whispered. Rebecca nodded grimly. They slipped into the creek just as flashlight beams converged on their hiding spot. The water was knee-deep and shockingly cold, but it muffled their movement. Jake led them downstream at a dangerous pace, jumping from boulder to boulder, using his natural orientation to avoid the worst obstacles. Behind them, voices shouted discovery of their trail. Control, targets located, pursuing south along Cedar Creek. All teams converge, do not let them reach the main trail. The creek descent was a nightmare of slippery rocks and hidden holes. Rebecca fell twice, soaking her gear and probably bruising her ribs, but she kept moving, showing the kind of determination that had kept her alive through 3 days of captivity. They reached the main trail at 3:15 a.m., with pursuit close behind. Jake's GPS, he'd managed to reboot it using a trick learned during his ranger years, showed 2 miles remaining to the trailhead. But this section of trail was exposed, well-maintained, perfect for rapid pursuit. Control, targets have reached main trail. Teams converging for final pursuit. Roger, observer stations maintain overwatch. Do not let them leave the operational area. Jake made a desperate decision. Instead of following the main trail, he led Rebecca directly upslope through dense forest. This route would take them over a steep ridge and down the opposite side, adding distance but avoiding the obvious pursuit routes. The climb was brutal. 45-degree slopes covered with fallen logs and thick underbrush. Rebecca was struggling now, her breathing labored, movements becoming clumsy with exhaustion. But Jake's spatial memory was guiding them toward a specific destination, an old helipad from the 1980s, located on the ridge crest. From there, they could see the entire operational area and plan their final approach. They reached the helipad at 4 a.m. Jake used his night vision to scan the valley below. Lights were moving in coordinated patterns along all the main trails. Vance's people had positioned themselves between Jake and the trailhead, with overlapping fields of observation. But Jake noticed something else. The search teams were focused on the trails and obvious routes. They'd left the steepest terrain unmonitored, probably assuming no one would attempt such dangerous descents in darkness. His spatial memory identified the route, a knife-edge ridge that dropped directly toward the parking area via a series of near-vertical descents. It was terrain that would challenge expert climbers in daylight, potentially lethal in darkness. But it was also the one approach Vance hadn't anticipated. "Rebecca, I need you to be honest about your climbing ability." She looked at the route Jake was indicating and went pale. "That's not climbing, that's controlled falling. It's our only chance. They have everything else covered." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, studying the impossible descent. "If I don't make it, will you still try to get out?" "We're both making it. Promise me something. If this bastard gets away, if he does this to other people, you'll come after him." Jake met her eyes. "I promise." They began the descent at 4:30 a.m. Jake led, testing each handhold, finding the safest route through terrain that defied safe passage. Rebecca followed with grim determination, her rock climbing experience showing in her careful movement and efficient use of available holds. The first section was a 60-foot descent down a near vertical rock face. Jake found a route using small ledges and tree roots, but it required absolute precision. One mistake would mean a fatal fall. Halfway down, Rebecca's foot slipped. She caught herself on a Douglas fir root, but her sharp intake of breath echoed in the still air. From below, a voice called out, "Control, did you hear that?" Sounded like someone on the north face. Negative. All teams maintained positions. They waited in frozen silence for 5 minutes before continuing. The next section was worse, a 70-foot descent with few handholds, requiring a combination of rappelling and free climbing techniques. Jake used his rope to set up a basic belay system, allowing Rebecca to descend with some safety margin. But they were racing against time. Dawn was less than 2 hours away, and they still had a quarter-mile of this terrain to navigate. At 5 a.m., they reached the final obstacle, a 100-foot cliff that dropped directly above the parking area. Jake could see the trailhead below, could see his truck waiting in the gray pre-dawn light. But this last descent was beyond anything they'd attempted. "Control, 30 minutes to sunrise. All teams report status. Team 2, main trail secured. Team 4, fire road network secured. Team 7, junction point secured." Vance's voice came over the radio. "Jake, you've done better than I expected, but you're out of time and options. Surrender now and I'll honor our agreement regarding non-lethal force." Jake keyed his radio. "Counteroffer. Meet me at the trailhead. Just you and me. Winner takes all." A long pause. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate." "I'm in a position you didn't plan for. Your people are covering routes I'm not using." Another pause. Jake could imagine Vance checking his displays, confirming that none of his teams had visual contact. "Very well. I'll meet you at the trailhead. But if you're not there in 30 minutes, the experiment ends with Rebecca's permanent disappearance." Jake studied the cliff face one more time. His spatial memory provided the route, a complex path using tiny ledges and root systems, requiring moves that would test the limits of human capability. But it was possible. Barely. "Last chance to reconsider," he told Rebecca. "Let's finish this." The descent took 25 minutes of careful, terrifying movement. Jake led every step, finding holds that shouldn't exist, following a route that defied gravity and common sense. Rebecca matched his moves with quiet courage, never complaining, never hesitating. They reached the parking area at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before sunrise. Jake's truck sat exactly where he'd left it, but so did a black SUV he didn't recognize. Dr. Thomas Vance stood beside the information board, alone and apparently unarmed. He was studying a trail map as if planning a casual day hike. "Jake, Rebecca," he called as they approached. "Congratulations. That was genuinely impressive." Jake kept his hand near his knife. "Our agreement. We'll be honored completely." Vance smiled. "You've taught me something important about human capability. I may need to revise some of my theoretical frameworks. Will you stop? No more experiments?" Vance considered this. "I'll certainly reconsider my methods. Perhaps there are less dramatic ways to study human adaptability." Rebecca stepped forward. "What about getting help? Professional help, I mean." Vance's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate the concern. But my research is too important to abandon. There are truths about human nature that need to be understood. Jake realized the man wasn't going to change fundamentally. The trauma that had broken his faith in humanity ran too deep. But maybe this encounter had planted seeds of doubt about his darkest conclusions. "Before we leave," Jake said, "I want to understand something. How did you know I'd come after Rebecca?" "Research. You have a pattern of taking personal responsibility for people in danger, going beyond normal professional obligations. Your file contains multiple incidents of extreme risk-taking to help strangers. You studied me for 6 months to understand my psychology, but you made one critical error." Vance raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You assumed I'd try to win by avoiding your people instead of defeating them. You prepared for someone who would run rather than fight. And?" Jake smiled grimly. "If you ever try this again with anyone, I won't be avoiding your people. I'll be hunting them. All of them. One by one." Vance studied Jake's expression and apparently decided he was completely serious. "I believe you would. Count on it." They parted without shaking hands. Vance drove away in his SUV, leaving behind only the memory of an impossible night and hard lessons about human nature on both sides. As Jake and Rebecca drove toward town, the sunrise painted the Olympic Mountains in shades of gold and pink. Rebecca was quiet for a long time before speaking. "Do you think he was right? About people becoming predators when survival is threatened?" Jake considered the question carefully. Some people do, but others become protectors. The choice is what makes us human. "And which choice did you make tonight?" Jake thought about the route he'd chosen, the risks he'd taken, the determination that had carried them through impossible terrain. He'd used abilities most people would consider supernatural, pushed his body and mind beyond normal limits, succeeded where logic said he should have failed. "I chose to be what people need me to be." Rebecca smiled for the first time since her ordeal began. "I think that's the point he missed. Humans don't just adapt to survive. We adapt to help each other survive." Jake nodded, understanding finally why he'd been able to do what seemed impossible. It wasn't just his special abilities or his experience. It was the simple fact that someone needed help, and he'd been in a position to provide it. That was what separated the protectors from the predators. Not superior capability, but the choice to use that capability for others. The forest fell away behind them as they headed toward town, toward safety, toward the ordinary world where most people never had to discover what they were truly capable of. But Jake carried with him the knowledge that when extraordinary situations arose, when the comfortable illusions of civilization fell away, some people became monsters, and others became heroes. The choice, as always, was entirely human. The Watcher in Olympic's shadow. David Harper pulled the worn leather boots over his thick wool socks. The familiar ritual as automatic as breathing after 12 years of mornings like this. 5:30 a.m., October 15th, and Olympic National Park's Hoh River Trail system waited in the pre-dawn darkness outside his cabin. Former ranger or not, some habits died hard. The missing hiker report had come in yesterday evening. Rebecca Chen, 26, experienced backpacker from Seattle, 3 days overdue from what should have been a simple overnight solo trip. Her car still sat in the Sol Duke Trailhead parking lot, untouched since Tuesday morning. The current rangers had done a preliminary sweep yesterday, found nothing. That's when they'd called Dave. "We need someone who knows these woods like you do," Ranger Williams had said over the phone. "Chen's an experienced hiker. If she's still out there after 3 days in this weather, something's wrong." Dave strapped on his pack, checking the contents one final time. Water, emergency shelter, first aid kit, GPS unit, radio, headlamp, backup batteries. His old compass hung from a cord around his neck. Technology failed, but magnetic north never lied. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees overnight, and the weather service predicted the first hard frost of the season tonight. The drive to Sol Duke took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads shrouded in fog. Dave's headlights carved through the gray murk, revealing glimpses of towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks that vanished again into the mist. By the time he reached the trailhead, the eastern sky had lightened to the color of old pewter. Rebecca Chen's blue Honda Civic sat alone in the gravel parking area, a thin layer of frost covering the windshield. Dave circled the vehicle, noting the Seattle Mountaineers sticker on the rear window, the worn hiking boots visible on the passenger floor. Nothing seemed disturbed. He pulled on his headlamp and approached the trailhead marker. The Sol Duc Trail began as a well-maintained path through old-growth forest, the kind of terrain that drew thousands of hikers every year. Dave had walked this route hundreds of times during his ranger years, knew every switchback and stream crossing. According to Chen's filed itinerary, she'd planned to hike 5 miles to the Sol Duc Falls, then continue another 3 miles to Deer Lake for an overnight camp. Dave set off into the forest as the first gray light filtered through the canopy above. His boots found the familiar rhythm on the packed earth trail, and he began to read the forest the way other people read newspapers. The first unusual thing he noticed was the silence, not complete silence. Water still gurgled in the creek beside the trail, and wind moved through the branches overhead. But the small sounds were wrong. No bird chatter, no squirrel movement, no rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. In October, the forest should have been alive with animals preparing for winter. Instead, it felt as empty as a cathedral at midnight. Dave stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening. After 30 seconds of focused attention, he heard it. Or rather, didn't hear it. The stream that should have been running parallel to the trail about 50 yards to his right had gone silent. Mountain streams don't just stop flowing. He left the main trail and pushed through the understory toward where the water should have been. Fallen leaves crunched under his boots, releasing the rich smell of decomposition and damp earth. When he reached the creek bed, he found it running normally, the water clear and cold over granite stones. But there, pressed into the soft mud beside the stream, was a boot print. Dave knelt beside the impression, his first special ability kicking in automatically. Exceptional tracking had been his gift since childhood, the ability to see details that others missed, to read stories written in disturbed earth and broken twigs. This print told him several things immediately. The boot was a size 9 hiking boot, probably a woman's size based on the narrower heel impression. The tread pattern matched expensive trail boots, not the cheap sneakers that unprepared day hikers often wore. The depth of the impression suggested someone carrying a full pack. Most importantly, the print was fresh, less than 12 hours old based on the way water had seeped into the deepest parts without fully filling them. This had to be Rebecca Chen. But something was wrong with the print's location. According to the topographic map, the official trail ran a full 100 yards west of this stream. An experienced hiker wouldn't have wandered this far off course without a specific reason. Dave studied the surrounding area more carefully. There, another print, this one heading upstream, away from the main trail. Then another, 20 feet further up the creek bank. Rebecca Chen had deliberately left the established trail and followed this stream into unmarked wilderness. Dave activated his radio. "Ranger station, this is Harper. I'm about 2 miles up Sol Duc Trail. Found tracks heading off trail toward the northeast, following Bear Creek upstream. Looks like our missing hiker went this direction." Static crackled, then William's voice came through. "Copy that, Dave. That area gets pretty rough terrain after about a mile. Lot of deadfall and steep grades. Why would an experienced hiker head that direction? Unknown. I'm going to follow the tracks. We'll radio again in 2 hours." "Roger. Be careful up there." Dave followed the boot prints along the creek bank, reading the story they told. Rebecca's stride length remained consistent. She hadn't been panicked or injured when she made this detour. But why leave the established trail? The terrain here was more difficult, the route unmarked and potentially dangerous for a solo hiker. After half a mile of careful tracking, Dave found his answer. There, wedged between 2 granite boulders beside the stream, was a yellow trail marker tied with bright orange flagging tape, the kind of marker that guided hikers along unofficial but well-traveled routes. Except Dave had never seen this marker before, and he knew every authorized trail in this section of the park. He examined the marker more closely. The yellow plastic was new, probably placed within the last week. The flagging tape was the standard bright orange used by trail maintenance crews, but something about it felt wrong. Dave touched the tape. It was the right material, the right color, but it lacked the faded, weathered look that came from weeks of exposure to mountain weather. Someone had placed this marker recently, someone who wanted hikers to follow this particular route. Dave's second special ability activated as he studied the false trail marker, nature reading, the capacity to interpret environmental signs that others missed. The forest around him was telling a story, and the story was wrong. The creek water ran clear, but there was a faint chemical smell in the air that didn't belong. Not strong enough to alarm most people, but noticeable to someone who'd spent years learning to identify every scent the wilderness produced. It reminded him of the cleaning solvents used in the ranger station restrooms. The animal behavior was wrong, too. He'd noticed the unnatural quiet earlier, but now he understood why. Animals had abandoned this area recently, not gradually the way they might respond to a change in food sources or weather patterns, but suddenly, something had frightened them away. Dave keyed his radio again. "Williams, I found an unauthorized trail marker up here. Someone's been placing fake route markers. This isn't a case of a lost hiker. Someone led her off the main trail deliberately." Long pause. "Are you sure about that, Dave?" "Positive. The marker's new, wrong location, and the animal behavior up here indicates something spooked the local wildlife in the last day or two. I think we're dealing with something more serious than a missing hiker case." "Jesus, okay. I'm calling in additional units and notifying the sheriff's office. Do not proceed alone, Dave. Wait for backup." "Negative. If Chen's still alive, time matters. I'll be careful, but I'm following these tracks." Dave switched off the radio before Williams could argue. He'd dealt with enough bureaucratic caution during his ranger years to know that waiting for backup might mean waiting too long. If Rebecca Chen was in the hands of someone who placed false trail markers, every hour counted. The tracks continued upstream, following what appeared to be a game trail that paralleled the water. Dave noticed that Rebecca's boot prints remained steady and confident for the first mile beyond the false marker. She'd been following what she believed was a legitimate trail, probably expecting it to loop back to the main route eventually. Then the tracks changed. Dave knelt beside a clear impression in a patch of soft ground. Rebecca's right boot print showed a distinct gouge mark along the outer edge, not from normal walking, but from a sudden sideways slip. The depth and angle suggested she'd stepped quickly to her right, as if avoiding something or someone. 20 feet further along, he found where her steady hiking pace had changed to shorter, more irregular steps. The boot prints showed she'd begun placing her feet more carefully, testing each step. The behavior of someone who'd realized she was in unfamiliar and potentially dangerous terrain, or someone who'd realized she was being followed. Dave activated his third special ability without conscious thought. Human presence detection, the capacity to sense when another person was nearby, even when they couldn't be seen or heard. It had saved his life during his Army years, before he'd become a ranger, and had proven invaluable during search and rescue operations in the wilderness. The sensation hit him like a cold wind. Someone was watching him. Dave continued following the tracks while his peripheral awareness swept the forest around him. The feeling grew stronger with each step, not the vague unease that anyone might feel in an isolated location, but the specific certainty that hostile eyes were tracking his movement. He paused beside a fallen log and pretended to examine something on the ground while actually scanning the forest behind him. Nothing visible, but the sensation of being observed remained constant. Whoever was watching him was good, skilled enough to remain hidden while maintaining visual contact. The tracks led deeper into unmarked wilderness, away from any established trail. After another half mile, Dave found the first real evidence of what had happened to Rebecca Chen. There, caught on a branch at shoulder height, was a small piece of blue nylon fabric, the kind used in high-end hiking jackets. But it wasn't the fabric that made Dave's blood run cold. It was the way the branch had been broken. Clean snap, too precise to be accidental. Someone had deliberately caught the fabric on this branch and then broken the branch to make the torn cloth more visible. Someone wanted the fabric to be found. Dave's fourth special ability kicked in as he studied the staged evidence. Investigative intuition, the ability to recognize patterns that others missed, to understand the logic behind seemingly random events. His mind began assembling the pieces of what was happening here. The false trail marker hadn't been placed randomly. It had been positioned to intercept hikers taking the Sol Duc Trail, probably Rebecca Chen specifically, based on the timing. Someone had studied her planned route and placed the marker where she'd be most likely to see it and follow it. The torn fabric was a message. Not an accident, not evidence of struggle, but communication. Someone was telling anyone who followed this trail that they had Rebecca Chen, and they wanted that fact to be discovered. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was planned, methodical, and the perpetrator wanted to be followed. Dave keyed his radio. "Williams, this is Harper. I'm about 3 miles northeast of the main trail now. Found evidence that Chen was taken deliberately. Someone's been planning this, and they want to be followed. I think I'm walking into a trap." Static. Then, "Dave, get out of there now. We've got backup units en route, but they're still 40 minutes out. Don't engage with whoever's doing this." "Can't do that. If Chen's alive, I might be her only chance. But I need you to know, if something happens to me up here, you're looking for someone with serious outdoor skills and psychological knowledge. This person understands how search and rescue operations work." "Dave." He switched off the radio and continued following the tracks. The forest around him had grown darker as clouds moved in overhead, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. The weather service had been right about the coming frost. The tracks led to a small clearing beside the creek, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by old-growth cedar trees. Dave approached the edge of the clearing carefully, using the massive tree trunks for cover. What he saw there made him understand exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. Rebecca Chen's campsite had been set up in the center of the clearing. Her blue tent was positioned perfectly, guy lines tight, rainfly properly secured. Her pack sat beside the tent, contents neatly organized on a tarp. A small camp stove was set up for cooking, with a pot of water ready to be heated. Everything looked normal, like a textbook example of proper wilderness camping technique. Except for one detail that made Dave's skin crawl. Rebecca Chen was nowhere to be seen, but her boots sat neatly beside the tent entrance as if she'd simply stepped out of them and walked away in her socks. Dave spent 10 minutes observing the campsite from the tree line, using every sense to gather information. No movement, no sounds of human activity, no smell of recent cooking or human presence. But his awareness of being watched had intensified. Whoever had set up this scene was nearby, probably observing his reaction. When he finally entered the clearing, Dave moved with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. Every step was planned, every movement calculated to avoid disturbing any evidence while remaining ready to react to an attack. The campsite had been arranged as a display. Rebecca's gear was spread out in a way that showcased her experience and preparation. High-quality tent, proper clothing layers, adequate food supplies, water purification system. Someone wanted anyone who found this site to understand that Rebecca Chen was a competent hiker who wouldn't have simply wandered off or made basic survival mistakes. Dave found Rebecca's hiking boots beside the tent entrance and knelt to examine them. The boots were unlaced but not carelessly removed. Each lace had been carefully loosened and tucked into the boot in the way that experienced backpackers stored their footwear overnight. But the socks that should have been inside the boots were missing. A thorough search of the visible campsite revealed no signs of struggle, no disturbed ground, no evidence of fear or panic. Rebecca Chen had apparently removed her boots, walked away from her perfectly organized campsite in her socks, and vanished into the wilderness, which was impossible. Dave stood in the center of the clearing and activated his fifth special ability, natural orientation, the capacity to navigate without instruments, to sense direction and location even in unfamiliar terrain. But this time he used it differently, extending his awareness outward to map the entire area around the clearing. The creek curved away to the northeast, following the natural drainage down from the high ridges. To the west, the terrain rose steeply toward a series of granite cliffs that would be difficult to climb without technical equipment. North and south, the forest continued in rolling hills covered with deadfall and thick undergrowth. But there was something else. a faint trail leading away from the clearing toward the northeast, so subtle that it would be invisible to most people. Not a game trail or an established hiking route, but the kind of path that someone might create by walking the same route multiple times over several weeks. Dave found the beginning of the hidden trail and knelt to examine the ground. Here, finally, were the tracks he'd been looking for. Rebecca Chen's sock-clad footprints clear in a patch of soft earth, heading into the forest. But alongside her prints were others, larger boot prints, deeper impressions that suggested someone carrying additional weight. The story written in the earth was clear. Rebecca had walked away from her campsite voluntarily, accompanied by someone else. No signs of coercion, no dragging marks, no indication of struggle. She'd gone willingly, or she'd been convinced to go willingly by someone skilled in psychological manipulation. Dave followed the hidden trail as it wound through increasingly difficult terrain. The path had been chosen carefully. It avoided areas where tracks would show clearly, stayed away from muddy ground and loose soil, and followed routes where the hard-packed earth and fallen leaves would conceal footprints from casual observation. After 20 minutes of careful tracking, the trail led to a massive fallen cedar tree that created a natural bridge across a steep ravine. The log was easily 3 feet in diameter, stable enough to walk across, but high enough above the ravine floor that a fall would mean serious injury or death. On the far side of the log bridge, someone had built a small lean-to shelter from fallen branches and cedar bark. The construction was expert level, tight enough to provide real protection from weather, positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks, built with the kind of skills that came from extensive wilderness experience. And sitting in front of the shelter, her back against a granite boulder, was Rebecca Chen. She was alive, apparently uninjured, but something was wrong with the scene. Rebecca sat too still, too perfectly positioned, like a mannequin arranged for display. Even from 50 yards away, Dave could see that her eyes were open and tracking his movement, but she made no attempt to call out or signal for help. Dave approached the edge of the ravine carefully, staying hidden in the tree line while observing the shelter. Rebecca was definitely alive. He could see her breathing, the occasional small movement of her head. But she remained silent and motionless in a way that suggested either severe trauma or chemical sedation. That's when he heard the voice. "You're quite good at this, Mr. Harper. Better than I expected, actually." The voice came from somewhere behind him, calm and conversational, with the kind of educated accent that suggested advanced education. Dave turned slowly, hands visible and empty, and found himself looking at a man in his early 50s who seemed completely at ease in the wilderness setting. Average height, lean build, graying hair, and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore high-quality hiking gear in muted colors, carried a large pack, and held a small pistol with the casual competence of someone comfortable with firearms. Everything about him suggested extensive outdoor experience and careful preparation. "Dr. Michael Voss," the man said, as if introducing himself at a faculty meeting. "Formerly professor of psychology at the University of Washington, currently engaged in research that the academic community wouldn't understand or appreciate." Dave remained perfectly still, his mind racing through options. Voss stood 20 feet away in a position that provided clear sight lines in all directions and easy retreat routes. The pistol was held professionally, not threatening, but ready. This was someone who'd thought through every detail of this encounter. "Rebecca is fine, by the way," Voss continued, mildly sedated to keep her calm but unharmed. "I'm not interested in causing unnecessary suffering. My research focuses on human behavior under stress, particularly the decision-making processes of individuals with exceptional skills when confronted with impossible choices." "What kind of research?" Dave asked, keeping his voice steady. Voss smiled, and something in that expression made Dave's skin crawl. It was the smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed explaining their work. "I study predator-prey relationships, Mr. Harper, specifically what happens when the traditional roles become blurred. You spent 5 years as an Army Scout, 12 years as a forest ranger, developed remarkable tracking and wilderness skills. You're an apex predator in this environment. But what happens when you encounter someone who studied your capabilities and planned accordingly? You're talking about murder. I'm talking about evolution in action. Natural selection doesn't stop because we live in cities and drive cars. The same pressures that shaped our ancestors are still operating. We've just moved the testing ground. Voss gestured toward the shelter where Rebecca sat motionless. Miss Chen was selected because her hiking patterns and skill level made her an ideal test subject. Her disappearance would draw someone with your capabilities into a controlled environment where I could observe how you respond to progressively complex challenges. Dave felt his sixth and final special ability beginning to activate: spatial memory, the capacity to recall exact details of locations he'd visited, sometimes years earlier. But this time, the memories weren't from years past. They were from this morning, and they were telling him something crucial about Voss's plan. "You've been watching me since I arrived at the trailhead," Dave said. "Earlier than that, actually. I've been studying your patterns for 3 weeks, ever since I learned that the Park Service contacts you for difficult search and rescue cases. This entire scenario was designed specifically for your capabilities. The false trail marker, the stage campsite, the hidden trail. You wanted me to follow this exact route. Of course. I needed to observe how your tracking skills work under pressure, how you process incomplete information, how you adapt when you realize you're being manipulated. You've been quite impressive, actually. Your ability to read environmental signs is remarkable." Voss adjusted his grip on the pistol slightly. "But here's where my research enters its crucial phase. I'm going to present you with a choice that will test the limits of your psychological conditioning. You can attempt to rescue Miss Chen, which will require crossing that log bridge while I maintain a clear shot at both of you, or you can retreat, save yourself, and abandon her to whatever fate I choose." "There's a third option," Dave said quietly. "Oh? I'd be interested to hear it." Dave's spatial memory had been processing every detail of the terrain around him, comparing it to the mental map he'd built during his approach. The ravine, the fallen cedar, the positioning of the shelter. He'd seen this configuration before, years ago, during a rescue operation in this same general area. "You made one mistake," Dave said. "You assumed I didn't know this terrain." Before Voss could react, Dave dove sideways and rolled behind a granite outcropping that his spatial memory had identified 20 feet to his left. Voss's first shot shattered bark from a tree where Dave had been standing, the sound echoing off the surrounding cliffs. Dave's mind raced through his recalled map of the area. The ravine curved back on itself about 100 yards downstream, creating a natural loop. During a rescue operation 6 years ago, he'd discovered that what looked like a single deep ravine was actually 2 parallel cuts in the earth, connected by a series of narrow passages that weren't visible from above, which meant there was another way to reach Rebecca Chen's position. Voss's voice called out from across the clearing. "Impressive reflexes, Mr. Harper, but you're in an untenable position. I control the high ground, I know your location, and Miss Chen remains my insurance policy. The longer you delay, the more her condition deteriorates." Dave didn't respond. Instead, he began moving carefully through the forest, staying low and using the terrain for cover. His natural orientation ability guided him toward the concealed passage he remembered from years ago. "I should mention," Voss called out, his voice carrying easily through the forest, "that my interest in predator-prey dynamics isn't purely academic. 7 years ago, my wife and daughter were killed by a man who stalked them for weeks before striking. The police called it a random crime, but I knew better. He'd studied them, learned their patterns, chosen them specifically because they fit his psychological profile." Dave found the concealed passage, a narrow gap between 2 granite formations that led down into the ravine system. He began descending carefully, testing each handhold. "The man who killed my family was never caught," Voss continued, his voice echoing strangely off the rock walls. "But I learned everything I could about how he operated, how he selected victims, how he studied their behavior, how he manipulated situations to his advantage. And I realized that he was right about one thing. We are all predators and prey, just playing out evolutionary scenarios." Dave reached the bottom of the ravine and began working his way through the maze of passages he remembered from the rescue operation. The rock walls rose 30 feet above him on both sides, blocking out most of the afternoon light. "The difference between him and me," Voss called out, his voice more distant now, is that I have the intellectual framework to understand what I'm doing. This isn't rage or madness, it's science. I'm testing the limits of human adaptation under extreme stress. Dave emerged from the passage system 50 yards downstream from Rebecca's position, on the same side of the ravine as the shelter. He could see Voss still positioned near the log bridge, watching the forest where Dave had disappeared. Rebecca Chen sat exactly where she'd been before, but now Dave could see her more clearly. She was conscious, but clearly under the influence of some kind of sedative. Her eyes tracked his movement as he approached, but she couldn't seem to focus properly or make coordinated movements. Dave reached her position and knelt beside her, checking for injuries while keeping one eye on Voss's location across the clearing. Rebecca appeared physically unharmed but was unable to speak coherently. Whatever drug Voss had given her was powerful enough to prevent normal communication, but not enough to render her unconscious. "Can you walk?" Dave whispered. Rebecca nodded slowly, but when she tried to stand, her coordination was too impaired for normal movement. Dave would have to carry her, which would make escape infinitely more difficult. That's when Voss appeared at the edge of the shelter clearing, having circled around through the forest to cut off Dave's retreat route. The man moved with surprising speed and agility for someone in his 50s. "Excellent tactical thinking," Voss said, raising his pistol. "I underestimated your knowledge of the local terrain. But you're still trapped, and now you've confirmed what I suspected about your psychological profile." "Which is what?" "That you'll risk your own life to save someone you've never met. It's a fascinating behavioral pattern. Evolutionarily disadvantageous, but remarkably persistent in certain personality types. I call it the guardian complex." Dave positioned himself between Voss and Rebecca, his mind calculating distances and angles. 30 feet of open ground to reach cover, with Voss holding a clear shot the entire way. "My research indicates that individuals with your psychological profile make predictable choices under extreme stress," Voss continued. "You'll attempt to shield Miss Chen even when doing so guarantees your own death. It's a completely irrational response, but remarkably consistent across test subjects." "Test subjects?" "Miss Chen isn't my first research opportunity, Mr. Harper. Over the past 2 years, I've conducted similar experiments with 12 other subjects. Rangers, police officers, military personnel, anyone whose profession suggests strong guardian instincts. The results have been remarkably consistent." Dave felt a cold understanding settle in his chest. The missing hikers the Park Service couldn't explain. The cold cases where experienced outdoors people just vanished. Research subjects who provided valuable data about human behavior under extreme stress. Most of them made the same choice you're about to make, sacrificing themselves in a futile attempt to save someone they couldn't actually protect. Voss adjusted his aim slightly. "But here's what makes you particularly interesting as a test subject. Your capabilities are significantly above average. If anyone could find a way to survive this scenario, it would be someone with your skills. So I'm genuinely curious to see how you respond." Dave's mind raced through possibilities, but every option ended with either his death or Rebecca's. Voss had positioned himself perfectly, controlled all the variables, planned for every contingency. The man was exactly what he claimed to be, a highly intelligent predator who'd studied his prey exhaustively. Except for one thing. Dave's spatial memory had been working continuously, building and updating his mental map of the terrain, and he'd just remembered something crucial about this location from the rescue operation 6 years ago. The fallen cedar that created the bridge across the ravine hadn't fallen naturally. It had been weakened by disease and brought down deliberately during a controlled removal operation to prevent it from falling across the main hiking trail, which meant the root system was still partially connected to the stump on the far side of the ravine. "You're right about one thing," Dave said to Voss. "I am going to try to save her, but you made the same mistake that the man who killed your family made." "Which is?" "You assumed that intelligence is more important than instinct." Dave grabbed Rebecca under her arms and dove toward the ravine edge, pulling her with him as Voss's shot echoed off the canyon walls. They tumbled down the steep slope in a controlled fall, using the loose rock and vegetation to slow their descent. Voss appeared at the edge above them, pistol ready, but Dave had already reached the base of the fallen cedar. The massive root ball provided perfect cover, and Dave positioned Rebecca behind it before looking up at his pursuer. "Impressive," Voss called down, "but you've merely delayed the inevitable. You're trapped in the bottom of a ravine with an injured woman and no way out." Dave didn't respond. Instead, he examined the root system of the fallen cedar, running his hands along the massive roots that still connected to the stump above. 6 years ago, the removal crew had explained that diseased trees often maintained partial root connections even after falling, creating natural tension systems that could be dangerous to work around. "I should mention," Voss continued, "that Miss Chen's sedation will begin wearing off in approximately 1 hour. When it does, she'll experience severe disorientation and possible cardiac complications. The drug I used wasn't designed for extended exposure." Dave found what he was looking for, the main taproot, still partially connected to the stump, stretched to its breaking point by the weight of the fallen tree. The connection point was 60 feet above them, visible as a thick root spanning the gap between the fallen cedar and the canyon wall. "You have a choice to make, Mr. Harper. Surrender now, and I'll give Miss Chen the antidote that will neutralize the drug in her system. Continue this futile resistance, and she'll die regardless of whether you escape or not." Dave picked up a fist-sized rock and called up to Voss. "You want to see the difference between intelligence and instinct?" Before Voss could respond, Dave hurled the rock with all his strength at the tension point, where the main root connected to the stump above. His aim was perfect. The rock struck the weakened connection with enough force to sever the last fibers holding the root system together. The massive cedar tree shifted with a grinding sound like breaking bones. Without the tension from the root system, the trunk began to roll, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The root ball where Dave and Rebecca sheltered lifted off the ground as the other end of the tree crashed down into the ravine. Voss had approximately 3 seconds to understand what was happening before 30 tons of diseased cedar tree slammed into the canyon wall where he'd been standing. The impact shook the ground like a minor earthquake and sent a cloud of dust and debris billowing up from the ravine floor. When the dust settled, Dr. Michael Voss was gone. The cliff edge where he'd stood had collapsed under the impact of the falling tree, taking him down into the maze of rock passages below. Dave could hear rocks still falling in the depths of the canyon system. Rebecca Chen was beginning to show signs that the sedative was wearing off. Her movements became more coordinated, and she was able to speak in short, clear sentences. "What happened?" she asked, looking around at the destruction. "Someone who thought he was smarter than the forest," Dave replied, helping her to her feet. "Can you walk?" "I think so. Everything's fuzzy, but I remember some of what happened." He said he was conducting research, kept talking about predators and prey. Dave activated his radio and was relieved to hear Williams's voice respond immediately. "Dave, we've been trying to reach you for 2 hours. What's your status?" "I've got Rebecca Chen. She's alive and mobile. The perpetrator is down, probably dead. We're going to need a full search and rescue team and a body recovery operation." "Thank God. What happened up there?" Dave looked around at the massive fallen tree, the collapsed canyon wall, and the debris field that had once been a carefully planned psychological trap. Someone learned the difference between studying the forest and understanding it. The hike back to the trailhead took 4 hours, with Rebecca leaning on Dave's arm as the last of the sedative worked its way out of her system. By the time they reached the parking area, the sun was setting behind the Olympic Mountains, and the first frost of the season was beginning to form on the windows of the vehicles. Rebecca Chen recovered fully from her ordeal, though she never returned to solo hiking. She became an advocate for improved trail safety and helped develop new protocols for reporting missing hikers that might prevent similar incidents. Dr. Michael Voss's body was never recovered from the depths of the ravine system, despite extensive search efforts. However, evidence found in his abandoned campsite led investigators to the remains of 7 other victims over the following months, bringing closure to families who'd been searching for missing loved ones for years. Dave Harper returned to his cabin that night with a deeper understanding of the difference between intelligence and wisdom, between studying the natural world and truly belonging to it. Some lessons could only be learned by those who understood that the forest was not a laboratory to be controlled, but a living system that demanded respect. The last entry in Dr. Voss's research journal, found at his campsite, read, "Subject exhibits remarkable adaptive capabilities. Initial hypothesis regarding psychological predictability may require revision. Further study recommended." He never got the chance to conduct that further study. The Olympic wilderness kept its secrets, as it always had, and Dave Harper went back to being just another former ranger who knew when to trust his instincts over his intellect. In the end, that knowledge had made all the difference between being predator and prey. The Last Hunt. Marcus Reed checked his watch as he pulled into the Olympic National Park Ranger Station parking lot. 6:47 a.m. The October morning carried that sharp bite that warned of winter's approach, and the fog hung low between the Douglas firs like smoke from some ancient campfire. He'd been retired from the Forest Service for 8 months now, but when search and rescue called about a missing hiker with his particular skill set needed, old habits kicked in. The missing person report sat on the passenger seat of his truck. Jennifer Walsh, 28. Experienced hiker from Seattle. Last seen 3 days ago at the Hoh River trailhead. Her planned route would take her deep into the temperate rainforest, a place Marcus knew like the blueprint of his childhood home. He gathered his gear methodically. GPS unit, though he rarely needed it, emergency beacon, first aid kit, water purification tablets, rope, his old Leatherman multi-tool, worn smooth from 15 years of ranger work. The familiar weight of preparation settled his mind into the focused state that had made him legendary among his former colleagues. The fog was lifting as he reached the trailhead where Jennifer's Honda Civic sat alone in the parking area. Marcus walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning the ground. Most people saw dirt, leaves, scattered debris. Marcus saw a story written in disturbed earth and bent vegetation. Jennifer's footprints were easy to follow initially. Size 8 hiking boots, relatively new treads, slight favoring of the left foot, probably an old ankle injury. She'd started confident, taking the main trail at a good pace. But within the first mile, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. A second set of prints. Size 11 boots, well-worn, careful placement. These weren't following the trail. They were following Jennifer. Marcus knelt beside a clear impression in the damp earth. The depth and stride pattern suggested someone around 180 pounds, athletic build, moving with deliberate stealth. But here was the detail that triggered his first real concern. The prints showed a conscious effort to step in places that would leave minimal trace. This wasn't a casual hiker who happened to be on the same path. Marcus stood and studied the forest around him. 15 years of tracking everything from lost children to black bears had taught him to read the subtle signs that others missed. The way branches broke, how animals moved, where people chose to step when they thought no one was watching. The morning sounds were wrong. In healthy, temperate rainforest, you heard layers of activity. Birds calling from different canopy levels, small mammals rustling through undergrowth, insects buzzing, water moving over stones. But here the silence felt deliberately empty, as if the wildlife had been recently disturbed by something unnatural. Marcus activated his radio to check in with the SAR coordinator. Static answered him. He tried again. Nothing. The GPS unit showed a clear signal, so it wasn't terrain interference. He made a mental note and continued following the trail. By 8:30 a.m., he was 2 miles in, and Jennifer's prints were showing signs of stress. Her stride had shortened and become irregular. She'd started stepping off the main trail more frequently, looking for something, or running from something. The followers' prints had changed too. They were closer now, more confident, no longer trying to remain hidden. Marcus found a spot where both sets of tracks converged near a fallen log. Jennifer had sat here. The heel impressions in the soft earth were deep, suggesting she'd rested for several minutes. The other person had approached from behind and stopped about 10 feet away. What happened next made Marcus's blood run cold. Jennifer's prints resumed, but now they were running. Not jogging, not power walking, full sprint, crashing through underbrush, taking risks no experienced hiker would take in unfamiliar terrain. The followers' prints showed a casual walk in the same direction. Marcus studied the scene more carefully. No signs of immediate violence, no blood, no torn clothing caught on branches. But something had happened here that transformed Jennifer from a confident hiker into panicked prey, and her pursuer had been in no hurry to catch up. The trail became harder to follow as Jennifer had left the established path completely, crashing through dense undergrowth in what appeared to be random directions. But Marcus's eyes caught details others would miss. Broken spider webs at shoulder height, moss scraped from tree bark at hand level, a thread of blue fabric, probably from her jacket, caught on a thorny vine. He was deep in the forest now, where the canopy filtered the morning light into a perpetual green twilight. The silence had become oppressive. No bird songs, no insect activity. Even the ever-present drip of moisture from the trees seemed muted. Marcus stopped and closed his eyes, letting his other senses take over. This was one of his more unusual abilities, one that had earned him skeptical looks from younger rangers who relied more on technology than instinct. He could sense human presence in a way that went beyond normal observation. Someone was watching him. The feeling came from his left, maybe 50 yards away. Not moving, just observing. Marcus opened his eyes and scanned the forest in that direction. Dense undergrowth, massive tree trunks, patches of fog still clinging to low areas, nothing obviously out of place. But the feeling persisted. Marcus had learned over the years to trust these instincts. They'd kept him alive during encounters with aggressive wildlife and helped him find people when logic and technology failed. Someone was definitely out there and they wanted him to know it. He continued following Jennifer's increasingly erratic trail, but now part of his attention stayed focused on his observer. The presence moved parallel to his course, maintaining distance never quite visible but always there. By 10 a.m., Marcus had climbed steadily into rougher terrain, where the forest gave way to steep slopes and rocky outcroppings. Jennifer's trail showed she was becoming exhausted. Her footprints were deeper, more careless, and she'd fallen at least twice based on the knee and hand impressions in the muddy spots. Then he found the first deliberate sign. On a large boulder beside a small creek, someone had placed 3 stones in a precise triangle. The arrangement was too perfect to be natural, and the stones weren't local to this area. They were smooth river rocks from much lower elevation. This was a message. Marcus examined the arrangement without touching it. The positioning suggested someone with knowledge of basic surveying or engineering. Precise angles, intentional placement. But why leave such an obvious marker? His radio crackled to life suddenly, making him jump. "Marcus, you copy?" The voice was Sarah Chen, the SAR coordinator. "Copy, Sarah. I'm about 3 miles in, following good tracks. Any sign of the subject?" Marcus glanced at the stone triangle. "Possibly. Trail indicates she may have encountered someone else out here." A pause. "Another hiker?" "Unclear. I'll update when I know more." "Roger. Check in every hour. Weather's turning bad later. Rain and wind expected by early afternoon." Marcus looked up at the sky through the canopy. Still mostly clear, but he could smell the moisture building in the air. Pacific Northwest weather could change quickly, and being caught in the mountains during a storm was dangerous for experienced hikers, potentially fatal for someone already in distress. He took a GPS reading and marked the stone triangle location, then continued following Jennifer's trail up the increasingly steep terrain. Her path showed growing desperation. She was taking routes that would be challenging for an experienced climber, let alone someone running in panic. The followers' tracks had disappeared entirely. Marcus stopped and studied the ground more carefully. Jennifer's prints were still clear in the soft earth beside the creek, but the second set had simply ended, about 20 yards back, where the ground transitioned from soft earth to rocky terrain covered with thick moss. Someone that skilled at hiding their tracks was either military trained or had spent serious time in wilderness areas. Combined with the deliberate stone arrangement, Marcus was dealing with someone who understood both woodland craft and psychological manipulation. The feeling of being watched intensified. Marcus turned slowly, scanning the forest around him. Movement caught his eye. a flash of dark clothing behind a massive cedar trunk about 40 yards uphill. By the time he focused on the spot, nothing was there. But on the ground where he was standing, Marcus noticed something that made his skin crawl. Fresh footprints in the mud beside the creek, size 11 boots, same pattern he'd been following. But these prints were facing back toward his position, and they were recent. The water hadn't had time to seep in and blur the edges. Someone had been standing right here, watching him examine the stone triangle, then moved away just before he looked up. Marcus's 15 years of experience kicked into high gear. This wasn't a rescue operation anymore. It was something much more dangerous. Someone was playing games, using Jennifer as bait to draw him deeper into isolated terrain. The question was why. He activated his GPS beacon and sent a distress signal to the SAR station, then immediately cursed himself as the device emitted a loud confirmation beep that echoed through the forest. If his observer hadn't known his exact location before, they did now. The silence that followed seemed to press against his eardrums. Marcus made a decision that went against his training but followed his instincts. Instead of continuing up Jennifer's trail, he changed direction and headed directly toward where he'd seen the movement. If someone wanted to play games in his forest, he'd oblige them. The terrain became increasingly difficult as he left the creek and climbed through thick undergrowth toward the cedar grove. Thorny vines caught at his clothing, and the ground was treacherous with hidden rocks and sudden drop-offs. This wasn't country for casual hikers, which made finding the camp even more unsettling. Hidden in a natural depression between two large outcroppings, someone had established a sophisticated bivouac. Military-grade shelter, barely visible under natural camouflage. Solar battery pack, water filtration system, and most disturbing, a clear view down to the creek where Marcus had been standing. The camp was empty but recently used. The sleeping bag still held body warmth. A small camp stove sat beside an empty cup that smelled of fresh coffee. Whoever had been here had left only minutes ago. Marcus studied the camp without entering it. The gear was expensive and well-maintained, not the equipment of a casual outdoorsman, but someone who spent serious time in remote areas. The camouflage job was professional quality. He would never have found it if he hadn't seen the movement and followed a direct line. A folded piece of paper was tucked under the edge of the solar battery, positioned where someone approaching the camp would see it immediately. Marcus approached carefully and unfolded the note. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. Mr. Reed, I know your reputation. 15 years with the Forest Service, specialized in tracking and wilderness rescue. Success rate of 94% for locating missing persons. You're very good at what you do. But this isn't a rescue operation anymore. Jennifer is safe for now. She's part of an experiment, and now so are you. I'm curious to see how your famous intuition holds up against careful planning. Follow the creek upstream. You'll find more instructions at the fallen bridge. Don't disappoint me. W.H. Marcus felt the world shift slightly, the way it does when you realize you've walked into something much bigger than you anticipated. This wasn't some random psychopath grabbing hikers. This was someone who had researched him specifically, planned this encounter, and was treating it like a chess match. He read the note again, focusing on the signature. W.H. The handwriting suggested education, possibly scientific or academic background. The tone was clinical, but with an undertone of genuine respect. This person knew Marcus's professional record and seemed genuinely interested in testing his abilities. The reference to a fallen bridge upstream meant his observer had extensive knowledge of local terrain. The old logging bridge had collapsed 3 years ago during spring floods, and it wasn't marked on any current maps. Someone would need to have explored this area extensively to know about it. Marcus activated his radio again, still static. He checked his GPS. Signal was strong, but somehow his radio communications were being blocked. That required sophisticated electronic equipment and technical knowledge. The picture forming in his mind was deeply troubling. Someone with wilderness expertise, electronic capability, detailed knowledge of local terrain, and specific information about Marcus himself had orchestrated this entire situation. Jennifer wasn't a random victim. She was bait to draw him into an elaborate game. But why? Marcus studied the camp one more time, looking for any detail that might provide insight into his opponent. The gear arrangement suggested someone methodical and organized. The choice of location showed tactical thinking, concealed position with good visibility and multiple escape routes. Everything about the setup indicated careful planning and significant resources. One detail caught his attention. Beside the camp stove was a small pile of stones, arranged in the same precise triangle pattern he'd found by the creek. But these stones were different. White quartz, not river rock. Another message, but what did it mean? The afternoon was wearing on, and the weather was beginning to turn. Marcus could smell rain in the air and the wind was picking up. Being caught in the mountains during a Pacific Northwest storm could be fatal, especially if someone was actively working against him. He made another decision that went against standard protocol. Instead of returning to report the situation and wait for backup, he headed upstream toward the fallen bridge. Every instinct told him that Jennifer's life depended on him playing this game, at least for now. The creek climbed through increasingly rugged terrain as it wound between massive boulders and under fallen logs. The sound of moving water masked any noise his opponent might be making, which worked both ways. Marcus could move more quietly too. His tracking abilities were in full focus now. Every broken branch, every disturbed pebble, every unusual shadow could be significant. The forest around him felt alive with potential threat, but also with information for someone who knew how to read it. A mile upstream, Marcus found the fallen bridge. The massive log structure had once carried logging trucks across the creek gorge. Now it lay in the water like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, its steel cables rusted and broken. The sight always made Marcus feel sad, another piece of the old forest operations, when men had come here to take rather than preserve. But today, the fallen bridge served as a message board. Attached to one of the steel cable ends was another note, this one longer and sealed in waterproof plastic. Marcus approached carefully, checking the surrounding area for any signs of ambush. The feeling of being watched was stronger here, but he couldn't pinpoint the source. The note was typewritten on expensive paper. "Mr. Reed, you found the camp faster than I expected. Impressive. Your reputation for wilderness intuition appears well-deserved. Jennifer is approximately 1 mile upstream from your current position, in a natural shelter that will keep her safe from the approaching storm. She's frightened but unharmed. However, her situation will become more precarious if you don't reach her before dark. You're probably wondering why I've arranged this encounter. The answer is both simple and complex. I'm a student of human potential, specifically the relationship between intelligence and instinct in survival situations. Modern society has convinced us that rational thought trumps primitive awareness. But I believe this is a dangerous delusion. You represent something rare, someone who has maintained and developed both intellectual capability and primal instincts. I want to test those abilities under pressure. Think of this as a practical examination. Your next challenge requires you to choose between 2 routes upstream. The creek forks about 200 yards ahead. The left fork leads through a narrow canyon with several technical climbing sections. The right fork follows a gentler path but crosses unstable terrain, where rock slides are common, especially during rain. Jennifer is at the end of the left fork, but I've arranged certain obstacles on both routes. Your survival skills will determine which path allows you to reach her safely. One more thing, Mr. Reed. Don't underestimate me because of my academic background. I've spent the last 5 years learning from people like you, hunters, trackers, military specialists. I may not have your instincts, but I have something equally valuable: the ability to plan for every contingency. The storm will hit in approximately 2 hours. Choose wisely. W.H. Marcus read the note twice, analyzing every detail. The writing style confirmed his suspicion about academic background. The reference to student of human potential suggested psychology or anthropology. Someone with enough resources to spend 5 years learning specialized skills and enough knowledge to research Marcus's background thoroughly. But there were gaps in the psychological profile that Marcus could exploit. The need to explain motivations, the compulsion to make this encounter fair by providing information. the obvious pride in planning and intellectual capability. These weren't the characteristics of a pure predator. They were the characteristics of someone trying to prove a point. The question was, what point? Marcus studied the terrain ahead. The creek did indeed fork about 200 yards upstream, just as described. The left fork disappeared into a narrow canyon between high rock walls. The right fork followed a more open path but crossed several areas where loose scree and unstable rock were visible even from this distance. Both routes were dangerous under ideal conditions. With a storm approaching and an intelligent opponent who had time to prepare obstacles, either choice could be fatal. But Marcus had advantages his opponent might not fully appreciate. He'd been working in this forest for 15 years. He knew every major trail, most of the minor ones, and had explored dozens of unofficial routes during rescues and wildlife tracking. More importantly, he knew how the terrain behaved during storms, where water collected, where rocks became unstable, where flash floods were likely. Marcus closed his eyes and let his spatial memory take over. This was one of his most unusual abilities, the capacity to recall exact details of locations he'd visited years earlier. He'd been to this creek fork before, during a search for a missing climber in 2019. The left fork canyon had several narrow sections where falling rocks were common, but there was also an old deer path that climbed along the south wall, bypassing the most dangerous areas. It wasn't visible from the creek level, but Marcus remembered helping carry an injured climber down that route. The right fork looked safer, but crossed a notorious slide zone. During the 2018 storm season, a massive rock slide had completely altered the creek channel in that area. The new configuration looked stable, but the underlying rock structure was fractured and unpredictable. More importantly, Marcus's memory told him something that wasn't in his opponent's note. There was a third route. About 50 yards back downstream, a game trail climbed the north wall of the canyon and connected with an old maintenance road that paralleled the creek at higher elevation. It would add distance but avoid both the technical climbing and the slide zone. Someone without extensive local knowledge wouldn't know it existed, but using the third route meant abandoning the game his opponent had set up. It meant refusing to be tested on the enemy's terms. Marcus made his decision based on 15 years of emergency experience. When someone else controlled the situation, changed the rules. He backtracked to the game trail and began climbing. The path was steep and overgrown, but Marcus's muscle memory from previous climbs guided him through the most efficient route. Within 20 minutes, he'd gained enough elevation to see both creek forks below him and identify the obstacles his opponent had prepared. In the left fork canyon, Marcus could see tripwires strung across the narrowest section. Not designed to cause serious injury, but enough to create delays or minor falls that could become dangerous during a storm. Technical challenges that would test climbing ability and route-finding skills. In the right fork, the obstacles were more subtle. Someone had apparently loosened key rocks in the slide zone, creating triggers that would bring down significant debris if disturbed. A test of observation skills and terrain reading ability. Both routes were designed to be passable for someone with Marcus's skills, but difficult enough to create time pressure and stress. The academic mind behind this game wanted to observe performance under pressure, not simply eliminate the subject. From his elevated position, Marcus could also see Jennifer. She was in a natural shelter formed by fallen trees about a mile upstream, just as promised. She appeared unharmed but was clearly under some kind of restraint. Her movements were limited to a small area around the shelter. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see what looked like an electronic device attached to her ankle. More troubling, he could see his opponent. The figure was partially concealed behind rocks about 100 yards from Jennifer's position, but Marcus's trained eye picked out the unnatural shadows and slight movements that betrayed human presence. The positioning allowed observation of both Jennifer and the approaches from either creek fork. But the elevated maintenance road Marcus was following would bring him to Jennifer's location from an unexpected direction. Marcus began moving along the old road, using every stealth technique he'd learned during his ranger years. The storm was building overhead, heavy clouds and increasing wind that would mask sound and movement. But it also meant time was running short. As he moved, Marcus began to understand his opponent's psychology more clearly. This wasn't about harming Jennifer, or even testing Marcus's survival skills. This was about proving a philosophical point. Someone believed that pure intelligence was superior to instinct, and wanted to demonstrate it by outthinking someone renowned for intuitive abilities. The academic background, the elaborate planning, the need to explain and justify. This was someone who had suffered a significant failure and was trying to rebuild their worldview through these experiments. But there was something his opponent hadn't accounted for. Marcus wasn't just surviving, he was hunting. The maintenance road curved around the head of the canyon and began descending toward the creek level again. Marcus could hear the sound of moving water getting louder as the approaching storm intensified the creek flow. He had maybe 30 minutes before the rain would make everything significantly more dangerous. From his new position, Marcus could see the shelter clearly. Jennifer was definitely restrained. The device on her ankle was connected to a cable that limited her movement to about a 10-foot radius. She appeared frightened but alert, occasionally looking around as if expecting either rescue or further threat. Marcus's opponent was no longer visible from this angle, which meant the tactical situation had changed. The carefully planned observation post was now partially blind to Marcus's approach, but that also meant Marcus was moving into unknown territory. Someone intelligent enough to plan this elaborate scenario would have contingencies for unexpected approaches. Marcus activated his GPS one more time to mark Jennifer's location, then noticed something that made him pause. The device was showing a second beacon signal, very close to his position. Someone else was carrying emergency GPS equipment. Either Jennifer had a second device, or his opponent wanted to be tracked. Marcus studied the signal carefully. The second beacon was moving slowly along the creek, following the path Marcus would have taken if he'd chosen the left fork route. Someone was walking directly into the prepared obstacles, making the kind of noise that would carry clearly in the thin mountain air. A diversion. Marcus's opponent was creating a false trail to mask movement toward a different position. But where and why? The answer came in the form of a rifle shot that echoed through the canyon. Not aimed at Marcus. The bullet struck a tree about 20 feet to his left, sending bark fragments flying. A warning shot, precisely placed to get attention without causing harm. Mr. Reed. The voice carried clearly across the water. Male, educated accent, probably mid-40s. Impressive route choice. I confess I didn't anticipate the maintenance road option. You're living up to your reputation. Marcus took cover behind a large boulder and scanned the area for the source of the voice. The acoustic properties of the canyon made it difficult to pinpoint exact location, but the voice seemed to come from somewhere near Jennifer's shelter. My name is William Hayes, the voice continued. Dr. William Hayes, formerly of the University of Washington Psychology Department. I believe we should have a conversation before you proceed any further. Marcus remained silent, using the time to study the terrain and plan his next move. Hayes was revealing information voluntarily, which suggested either supreme confidence or psychological need for validation. I know you're analyzing the situation, Mr. Reed. It's exactly what I would do. You're wondering why I've arranged this encounter, what I hope to gain, whether Jennifer is truly safe. All reasonable questions. The voice was moving. Hayes was changing position while talking, probably using the sound of his own voice to mask movement. Smart, but not perfect. Marcus's trained ear could track the subtle changes in acoustic direction. I lost my wife and daughter 5 years ago, Hayes continued. Wilderness accident in the North Cascades. Despite my preparation, my planning, my superior intellect, I couldn't save them. Do you know why, Mr. Reed? Marcus was beginning to understand the psychological profile. Massive guilt, need for validation, testing himself through surrogates. Hayes had probably been a competent academic who faced a situation where knowledge couldn't overcome environmental factors. Because I ignored my instincts. Hayes's voice was closer now, somewhere between Marcus and Jennifer. I had a feeling something was wrong with the weather, but my rational mind dismissed it as paranoia. I trusted technology over intuition, planning over awareness, and they died because of my intellectual arrogance. The pain in Hayes's voice was genuine. This wasn't a simple predator or psychopath. This was someone who had suffered catastrophic personal loss and was trying to rebuild his worldview through these dangerous experiments. But understanding motivation didn't make Hayes less dangerous. So I decided to learn, Hayes continued. I spent the last 5 years studying people like you, rangers, hunters, trackers, survival specialists. I wanted to understand what you have that I lost. And you, Mr. Reed, represent the pinnacle of that development. Marcus caught movement near the shelter. Hayes was approaching Jennifer's position from the upstream side, using rocks and fallen trees for concealment. The rifle was visible, a modern hunting rifle with scope, held competently but not with the fluid familiarity of a lifelong shooter. But I've learned something interesting during my studies. Hayes was almost to the shelter now. Instinct and intelligence aren't mutually exclusive. The best wilderness specialists combine both. So my experiment is this. Can pure intelligence, properly applied, match developed instinct in survival situations? Marcus realized that Hayes wasn't trying to harm Jennifer or him. He was trying to prove that his newly acquired skills could match Marcus's natural abilities. This was a test of 2 different approaches to survival and environmental awareness, which made Hayes both more predictable and more dangerous. Predictable because his motivations were clear, dangerous because he had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Marcus made his move. Instead of trying to approach the shelter stealthily, he stood up from behind the boulder and walked directly toward Hayes's position. Bold action when stealth was expected, using Hayes's own academic curiosity against him. Dr. Hayes, Marcus called out. I understand your situation, but this isn't the way to resolve it. Hayes appeared from behind the shelter, rifle raised but not aimed directly at Marcus. Mr. Reed, I was hoping you'd be willing to discuss this face-to-face. Please, approach slowly. I'd prefer this remain a conversation rather than a confrontation. Marcus walked steadily toward the shelter, hands visible but ready to move quickly if necessary. He could see Jennifer clearly now, scared but unharmed, watching the exchange with wide eyes. The device on her ankle was definitely an electronic restraint, probably with some kind of proximity alarm. You've done your research on me, Marcus said as he got within conversational distance. What did you learn? Hayes lowered the rifle slightly, his face showing genuine interest. That you've spent 15 years developing something most people have lost completely. The ability to read environmental cues that rational analysis would dismiss. You find people when technology fails because you trust information that can't be quantified. And you think you've learned to replicate that? I've learned the techniques, Hayes replied. Tracking, route finding, wilderness survival, even basic hunting skills. But I suspect there's something more fundamental that can't be taught. Marcus studied Hayes carefully, mid-40s, physically fit, expensive outdoor gear worn with familiarity. His hands showed calluses from recent outdoor work, and his movements suggested someone who'd spent serious time in rough country. But there was a tension in his posture that spoke of intellectual effort rather than natural ease. You're right, Marcus said. There is something that can't be taught, but it's not what you think. Explain. Marcus gestured toward the surrounding forest. You see this as a testing ground, a place to prove theories about intelligence versus instinct. But that's still the academic mindset. The forest isn't a laboratory. Then what is it? It's alive. It's a community of interconnected systems that respond to disruption. When you brought Jennifer here against her will, when you set up your obstacles and prepared your tests, you created ripples that affected everything around you. Animals changed their behavior patterns. Water flow shifted slightly. Even the way light filters through the trees is different. Hayes frowned, clearly thinking about this. You're saying you detected my presence through environmental changes? I'm saying the forest told me you were here before I saw any direct evidence. That's not a skill you can learn in 5 years. It's a relationship you develop over decades. And you think this gives you some advantage? Marcus smiled grimly. I think it already has. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp electronic beep from the device on Jennifer's ankle. Hayes glanced at it, and his expression changed to concern. What's that? Marcus asked. Proximity alarm. Something large is moving toward us from downstream. Marcus listened carefully. Heavy footsteps moving through undergrowth without much concern for stealth. Multiple individuals based on the pattern of sounds. But something was off about the acoustic signature. Your backup SAR team? Hayes asked. Marcus shook his head. Too early, and they'd be moving more carefully in unknown terrain. The footsteps were getting closer, and now Marcus could hear voices. But the conversation didn't sound like search and rescue professionals. It sounded like casual hikers discussing trail conditions and weather. Hayes raised the rifle again, but his hands were shaking slightly. This wasn't part of the plan. Plans change, Marcus said. That's the difference between laboratory conditions and real life. 3 hikers emerged from the trees near the creek, young adults with heavy packs and the slightly lost expression of people who weren't entirely sure where they were. They saw the shelter and started walking toward it, probably hoping for directions. Hayes looked panicked. His carefully controlled experiment was being disrupted by random chance, exactly the kind of uncontrollable variable that academic minds struggled with. They can't see her restrained, Hayes muttered. They'll call for help, bring authorities. Marcus realized this was his opportunity. Hayes's rigid planning hadn't accounted for unexpected complications, and his psychological need for control was creating paralysis. Dr. Hayes, Marcus said quietly, this is what I was talking about. The forest isn't a controlled environment. Things happen that you can't predict or manage. Jennifer needs to be freed before those hikers realize something's wrong. Hayes stared at the approaching hikers, then at Jennifer, then at Marcus. His entire worldview, 5 years of training and planning, was colliding with uncontrollable reality. I can help you end this without anyone getting hurt, Marcus continued. But you have to trust my judgment about how to handle the situation. The hikers were close enough now that Marcus could hear their conversation clearly. They were discussing the weather and debating whether to turn back before the storm hit. Young voices, probably college students on a weekend adventure. Hayes made his decision. He lowered the rifle and pulled a small remote control from his jacket. The electronic device on Jennifer's ankle emitted a soft click and fell away. Go, he said to Marcus. Handle it. Marcus walked toward the hikers, intercepting them before they could see Jennifer clearly. Hey folks, how's the trail treating you? Oh, thank God, one of them said, a young woman with a cheerful expression. We're so lost. Is this the way back to the main trail? Actually, you want to head back the way you came and take the right fork when you hit the creek junction, Marcus said. Storm's coming in fast. You should get to lower elevation as quickly as possible. Are you camping up here? Another hiker asked, gesturing toward the shelter. Just taking a break before heading back down, Marcus replied smoothly. Trust me, you don't want to be caught up here when this weather hits. The hikers looked at the darkening sky and agreed quickly. They thanked Marcus and headed back downstream, eager to reach safety before the storm. Marcus watched them disappear into the trees, then returned to where Hayes and Jennifer waited. Jennifer was standing now, rubbing her ankle where the restraint had been. She looked at Marcus with confused relief. Are you here to rescue me? That's the plan, Marcus said. Are you hurt? Just scared. He said he wouldn't hurt me if I cooperated. Marcus looked at Hayes, who was standing motionless with the rifle pointed at the ground. The academic appeared to be processing the entire experience, trying to integrate what had happened with his theoretical framework. Dr. Hayes, Marcus said, Jennifer needs to get back to safety before this storm hits, but I think you and I should finish our conversation first. Hayes looked up, his expression showing intellectual curiosity mixed with resignation. You handled that perfectly. Confident authority, reasonable explanation, decisive action. I would have overthought it. That's the difference between knowledge and experience, Marcus said. You learned the techniques, but you didn't develop the judgment that comes from thousands of small decisions under pressure. So I failed the test. You passed it, Marcus replied. You recognized when you were in over your head and made the right choice. That's intelligence serving instinct, not competing with it. Hayes stared at him for a long moment. My wife and daughter died because I couldn't do what you just did. I had all the information I needed, but I couldn't act on it decisively. 5 years ago, you were a psychology professor dealing with a situation outside your experience, Marcus said. Today, you're someone who's spent years learning wilderness skills and demonstrated the judgment to end a dangerous situation safely. You've already become what you thought you needed to be. The first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and cold. Hayes looked at the sky, then at Jennifer, then at Marcus. What happens now? He asked. Now we get Jennifer back to safety, Marcus said. After that, you and I have some things to discuss with law enforcement. But Jennifer's safety comes first. Hayes nodded and shouldered his pack. The maintenance road will be the safest route down in this weather. Agreed, Marcus said, impressed despite everything that Hayes had identified the best option quickly. As they began the hike back toward civilization, with Jennifer between them and the storm building overhead, Marcus reflected on what he'd learned. Hayes wasn't a predator or a psychopath. He was someone who'd lost everything to a moment of hesitation and spent 5 years trying to rebuild himself into someone who could act decisively in crisis situations. The tragedy was that he'd already succeeded. His planning had been meticulous. His wilderness skills were genuinely impressive. And when the unexpected happened, he'd made the right choice. He'd become the person he thought his family needed, just 5 years too late. But perhaps that was the most important lesson. Some skills could be learned, but wisdom came from experience, including the experience of failure. Hayes had needed to fail again, in a controlled way, to understand that he'd already learned what he needed to know. The storm broke over them as they reached the main trail, but Marcus's spatial memory guided them safely back to the parking area. By the time they reached the ranger station, Jennifer was exhausted but safe. Hayes was ready to face the consequences of his actions, and Marcus had a story he'd be processing for years to come. Later, after the paperwork and interviews and medical checks, Marcus sat in his truck watching the rain cascade down the windshield. His phone showed 17 missed calls from SR teams and law enforcement. But for now, he just wanted to sit quietly and think about what had happened. Hayes had been wrong about intelligence versus instinct. The best wilderness professionals didn't choose one over the other. They integrated both into a single decision-making process. But Hayes had been right about one thing. Most people had lost touch with their intuitive abilities, and that loss made them vulnerable in ways that technology couldn't compensate for. Marcus started his truck and headed home, carrying with him a renewed appreciation for the balance between knowledge and wisdom, between planning and adaptation, between the lessons that could be taught and the understanding that could only be earned through experience. The forest had taught them both something important that day. For Hayes, it was that he'd already become the person he thought he needed to be. For Marcus, it was that teaching sometimes happened in the most unexpected ways, and the most important lessons often came from people who thought they were the students.